What is the root of all evil? What is the main source of everything that is bad in the world? This is a pretty common question, and you might get a lot of different answers to this question. Some people might say violence. Some people might say corruption, liars, the Jonas Brothers. But some people argue something a little bit different. They argue that the source of all evil, the root of all evil, is belief. And for these people, they would say that in order for you to do something that is evil or wrong, you probably have to believe it. And in order to commit crimes and atrocities on large historical scales, you need people at the top of the food chain that actually believe what they're doing. I mean, it only makes sense. In order for you to do something, you probably need to believe in it. What would the world look like if nobody believed in anything? What would a world look like with no belief? In my opinion, you'd probably just have a bunch of mindless zombies running around doing nothing. So in order to get rid of all that's evil, you could get rid of all of belief, and this would probably solve the problem. But on the other hand, nobody wants to live in a world where it's just mindless zombies walking around and nobody believes in anything. Which brings us to the next point that people who subscribe to this theory would say is that not only is belief the root of all that's evil, it's also the root of all that's good. So beliefs can be misguided, they can be incorrect, they can be distorted, but they're always there. And it's these beliefs that can form the basis of actions that lead to great harm, and also beliefs that lead to actions and systems and societies that are filled with happiness and joy. This yin and yang of belief makes it powerful. It has the ability to do great good and great evil. And things that are powerful often lead to conflict. A historian by the name of Samuel Huntington was someone who thought along these lines about belief. And he had the idea that the future of world conflict would not be about governments or ideologies. It would be about belief systems and cultures and the way people lived and how this kind of conflicted with ways that people in other parts of the world lived. So different cultures and different belief systems clashing with each other, this would be the future of world conflict. And this idea is called the clash of civilizations. Before we delve into the clash of civilizations, I just want to state up front that this theory is extremely controversial, and some people are hard proponents of it, and others are hard detractors of it. It's very difficult to find a position that is somewhat middle ground when it comes to the clash of civilizations. And I would kind of caution against this. So it seems like in the study of history and maybe different theories in history or even just stuff in everyday life, it seems like someone comes up with something and most people scrutinize it and determine it to be either completely useful or completely useless. And I would caution against this because just because you don't agree with one aspect of a theory or something a person said doesn't mean that there's nothing of value that can be taken from the overall ideas. Just because you don't believe in one thing that someone said, that doesn't invalidate everything else that they will say in the future or have said in the past. I feel like people do this all the time where if there's one small mistake in a large body of work, they'll just dismiss the whole thing. Or on the other hand, if there's one small nugget of truth in a huge theory, then they would go saying this is the greatest theory, greatest thing since sliced bread. So I'll attempt to take more of a middle ground on this one because I think there are some things that are useful, but I also think there's some things that Huntington gets wrong with the clash of civilizations theory. Samuel Huntington looks at the history of conflict since around the early 1600s, and he determines that there's a distinct progression to the way that these big conflicts happen throughout the world. And he thought that a lot of this conflict that happened in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s was kind of a Western Civil War. So Huntington sees Western civilization as one of a handful of civilizations that we'll talk about, and he thought that first there was kind of battles amongst princes and nation states, stuff like the 100 Years' War and stuff like the 30 Years' War before that. And this kind of gave way to more conflicts between nation states like World War I. And then finally in the 20th century, we got battles between ideologies. So Huntington kind of saw World War II as the battle between, fascism and communism and democracy kind of struggling. And then after that, we got the Cold War, and this was kind of continuing that struggle of ideology with, the Soviet Union and communism, and China and communism versus the United States and kind of Western European countries, democracy versus communism, struggle for ideology. Now that the Cold War is over, we need a new way to kind of figure out what's going to be the main source of conflict in the world going forward. And Huntington saw this as the clash of civilizations. That's the new era that we're heading into now. So what is a civilization? Well, here's what Huntington has to say, quote, "A civilization is thus the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. It is defined both by common objective elements, such as language, history, religion, customs, institutions, and by the subjective self-identification of people. People have levels of identity. A resident of Rome may define himself with varying degrees of intensity as a Roman, an Italian, a Catholic, a Christian, a European, a Westerner. The civilization to which he belongs is the broadest level of identification with which he intensely identifies." End quote. Okay, so obviously you can go read it for yourself, all of Huntington's stuff, but you can tell that it's kind of vague and a little bit difficult to understand what he's talking about there. So, for example, take a person who lives in Beijing. Okay, they would identify themselves as a resident of Beijing. They would also identify themselves as being part of a province in China that includes various other cities, and then even bigger than that, a larger Chinese state. And they would kind of identify with this Chinese civilization. But does that person have anything to identify them with, let's say, Kenya? Probably not. So for Huntington, it seems useful to separate these various civilizations into separate categories. That, of course, begs the question, what are these civilizations? So Huntington says that there is Western civilization, and this includes America, parts of North America, most of Western Europe. There is Confucian or Chinese civilization, which is China. Japanese civilization, Islamic civilization, which includes much of the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia. There's Hindu civilization, which includes mostly India, Slavic Orthodox, which includes Eastern Europe and Russia, Latin American, and African civilization. And he makes a point to point out that civilizations can rise and fall, they can change, they can grow, they can be destroyed, so nothing is necessarily set in stone when it comes to a civilization. The key for Huntington is that civilizations don't necessarily have to conflict, but if you look at history and if you look at these various factors that he thinks will, predict the future, basically, we are going to see a lot of these civilizations clashing with each other. Why is that the case? Why do civilizations conflict with each other? Well, one reason is that it's the most basic level of difference between people. So a difference in a civilization entails differences of history, culture, tradition, and most importantly, religion. And these differences of culture and religion and belief, these are the product of millennia of history. So these differences are not going to disappear overnight. I mean, try changing someone's mind on the topic of religion or culture or, deeply ingrained beliefs that have been passed down from family to family. that's going to be incredibly difficult to do. So it just seems kind of natural that we have these divisions between these different cultures. And when you have cultures that have differences and civilizations that have differences, when they kind of rub up against each other, that could lead to problems. One way to look at the clash of civilizations is to kind of look at it like plate tectonics in earth science. So imagine you have that realm of Western civilization, and then that's kind of one plate, and then you have Islamic civilization and Eastern Orthodox, Chinese, Hindu, etc. All these different kind of tectonic plates are slowly kind of grinding up against each other, and when they meet, what happens with tectonic plates? There's conflict, and you either get mountains or chasms or whatever. I was never any good at earth science, by the way. And in the same way, when these civilizations meet, you're going to get clashes very similar to the plate tectonic theory. Why would these conflicts happen more often as we go forward into the future? Well, one big thing is globalization. So the world is getting smaller. Civilizations are coming into contact with each other more, and their differences are highlighted even more. Fundamentalists who would otherwise just be regional players at best can now become global menaces just by hopping on an airplane. This type of globalization and the way that now all of these civilizations are connected can actually contribute to the fault lines of those tectonic plates, these civilizational fault lines, beginning to come into conflict and creating disturbances. As it turns out, Samuel Huntington, the guy who came up with the theory, actually passed away before the internet really came into its own. But in my opinion, at least, the internet is something that I think is a huge factor as far as contributing to this globalization and the world getting smaller. Now, all of a sudden, all you have to do to see and get exposed to a completely different set of beliefs and cultures and religions to you is just hop on Twitter. And if you aren't necessarily equipped to handle that maturely and rationally, you can see all you have to do is just hop on the internet and see kind of ignorance and conflict arising out of differences. Huntington actually goes on to say that conflicts between civilizations are not easily resolved. So it's very difficult to, again, when you have ideas, beliefs, traditions that are ingrained in you from your family and generations of family before you, it's difficult to reconcile those with different beliefs and different systems and different civilizations that have the same situation going on with them. So if conflict does arise, it's going to be very difficult to resolve it. And this is exactly what leads to the dreaded us versus them dynamic. When thinking about stuff like this, it's important to make sure that you still have values and principles behind the beliefs that you have. And it's almost like values could become less important, according to Huntington, and values are becoming less important. And what's becoming more important is your identity as a civilization and which team you kind of line up on. So Huntington cautions against what's known as tribalism, which is basically just you picking your team because those are the people around you, and that's kind of the us part of it. And then anyone who's not on that team is the them. And making political and geopolitical decisions based on that can be dangerous. Unfortunately, it's very easy for politicians, we've seen this throughout history, it's very easy for politicians to mobilize support politically just by appealing to kind of that us versus them dynamic. I mean, what a classic motivational tool. I mean, just look at the average football coach in the locker room giving his speech before the game. He's applying the same psychological dynamics of us versus them to kind of motivate his players against the enemy players. So the reason tribalism works is because that it's easy, it's effective, and it's dangerous. So that is the clash of civilizations in a nutshell. Basically the idea that there's a handful of civilizations out in the world, and these civilizations have different beliefs, religions, traditions, histories, and because of those differences, you are going to see conflicts more and more throughout the future. Although I don't think that Huntington gets everything right, I do think that he does have a couple of things that are useful and we can use to kind of understand the world a little bit better. Huntington actually predicted that what he calls Western culture would be in conflict with what he calls the Islamic culture or the Islamic civilization. And perhaps this would help explain why it seems like the United States and maybe some other Western European countries are seemingly consistently at war in the Middle East. That's probably a episode for another time, but clearly there's conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The list goes on and on and on, it seems like. And it is statistically true that if you were to separate it from Western civilization versus the other civilizations, Western civilization is at conflict, at least violent conflict, more with Islamic civilization than any other, for whatever reason that might be. The clash of civilizations theory could also possibly explain some of the animosity and the hostility towards migrant groups and refugees from a variety of actors on the world stage. When you have that us versus them dynamic going, it seems like migrants and refugees would be a group of people who might not be exactly welcomed into a new civilization. And of course, this is something going on in the news, as this podcast is going, and there's arguments for both sides of whether it's good or not good to bring in these migrants and bring in these refugees. Many people look at the recent kind of popularity and seemingly increased popularity of terrorism throughout the world, and many people look to the clash of civilizations and kind of see that as, oh, well, this kind of makes sense. Again, now that we have a global society, a small group of fundamentalists not only become kind of just local and regional players, but they can become a menace on the global stage. Many historians think that the clash of civilizations kind of accurately depicted what some people see as a rise in tribalism as far as politics go. A lot of journalists and people kind of looking at world events today feel like there's a rising nationalism going on in a variety of different countries, from Europe to Africa to even the United States. And the kind of central ideas, beliefs behind the clash of civilizations might actually be useful in analyzing that. As I was reading through the Clash of Civilizations, I was kind of thinking to myself and wondering, why is there so much conflict in the Middle East? It seems like there's more conflict there than any other place. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but at least there's more, stories in the news about conflict there. And it got me thinking that that kind of region of the world is at the confluence of maybe 3, maybe 4 different civilizations. And if you go back to that tectonic plate example where those different civilizations meet and where, different civilizations have different interests in the same area, that's going to be where conflict is ripe to erupt. I think the clash of civilizations as a theory can definitely be useful to explain certain things and maybe offer up some ideas to think about further and discuss further, but I also think there's some significant weaknesses to the theory. My first gripe with the theory is that he kind of makes it seem as if the main big conflicts in the history of the world are clashes between different civilizations. And I'm just not sure if this is exactly true. It seems a little bit questionable. Some of the worst wars and worst conflicts in the history of the world, take World War II, take World War I. Millions and millions of people dying. These were not civilizational conflicts. These were conflicts within what Huntington would call Western civilization. A historian by the name of Fox kind of took the ball and ran with it in 2002 when they did a study and showed that 47.6% of conflicts worldwide have absolutely nothing to do with civilizations clashing. 37.8% of conflicts have some sort of relationship to civilizations clashing, and then 14.5% are just indigenous conflicts. So it seems like the majority of conflicts are not civilizational conflicts. But what about terrorism, you say? Many people look at September 11th and recent terrorist events all over the world, whether it's the United States, France, North Africa, the Middle East, and they say, boom, clash of civilizations, this is what's happening. Well, the truth is that there's no more terrorism by Islamic fundamentalists against what's quote-unquote Western civilization than against their own Islamic civilization. Muslims are far and away the biggest victims of that particular version of terrorism. And that seems to be the case with most fundamentalist terrorist groups. The groups within that civilization are the ones that are taking the burden and taking the most casualties and the most suffering. And this seems to be a point that is lost on a lot of people, so I'll try and state it very clearly that the biggest victims of terrorism are the people who live in that particular civilization close by. Furthermore, two historians by the name of Neumeyer and Plumper did a study in 2009, and they showed that there doesn't really seem to be a big difference in pre-Cold War terrorism versus post-Cold War terrorism. So the overall patterns of terrorism haven't really changed much, even though, according to Huntington, there should be a shift after that kind of bipolar Cold War era gives way to the clash of civilizations. So these civilizational conflicts that we often see in the news between whatever civilizations they might be, these tend to grab more of the headlines, but in general, the overall patterns of conflict have not changed that much over the course of the past couple decades. Huntington also talks quite a bit about, there's kind of a confusing section in there about a Islamic, Chinese, Confucian kind of alliance that could be a problem for Western civilization. And to me, that part just didn't really make a lot of sense, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of any sort of alliance going on there, at least in the modern day that I can see. But again, maybe I'm just not looking hard enough. I don't think that the clash of civilizations is a rock-solid empirical theory by any means. In fact, as we just went over, there's a ton of major problems with it and things I don't agree with. But there are some things in there that could be useful and might be interesting to further the discussion. I don't think there's going to be any global civilization anytime soon, and people are going to naturally kind of gravitate towards the people that believe things and go to religious ceremonies and have traditions and histories that are similar to their own. So as long as there's differences, we have to learn to live with each other and kind of coexist with each other. If an us versus them mentality continues to grow and continues to become popularized in politics, Huntington himself even argues this is bad and could lead to a possible World War III scenario. So rather than us versus them, let's think about what types of values that you enjoy and you want to uphold. Learn about what your opponent's values are, what do they enjoy, what do they uphold, and then try to find some areas where these values overlap, and then you can make progress that way. I think that us versus them is natural and not necessarily inherently wrong. It's natural to group together. It's natural to trust members of your community, your family, the people around you. But that can't be the be-all and end-all. There has to be further discussion, rational discourse, and the ability to find out which values are useful and which values promote the most well-being for people. So when it comes to the clash of civilizations, in the end, perhaps embracing common values and our common humanity will be more beneficial than emphasizing our differences. Okay, so that's my thoughts on the clash of civilizations. Definitely wanted to get this one to you right before Thanksgiving, so make sure to bring this one up at the dinner table with grandma and your crazy uncle and the rest of your family around to make sure you have the maximum amount of chaos and fireworks around the Thanksgiving table. Be sure to let me know how that goes. You can also talk about your own thoughts on the Clash of Civilizations. Send me your thoughts. Email me at reflectinghistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to rate it, review it, tell a friend, tweet about it. Do whatever you got to do to support it. That would be very much appreciated. As always, thank you for listening, and that's it for me.